The smell of rubber cement and old newsprint, a low, sweet chemical smell that coats the back of the throat, hung stagnant in the basement of the Plain Dealer building. It was a Tuesday morning, and the subterranean air was already vibrating with the distant, rhythmic thud of the printing presses 2 floors away. Down here, in the newspaper's morgue, time was measured not by the ticking of the wall clock, but by the steady accumulation of the dead. Miriam Voss sat at her steel desk, perfectly aligned with the edges of the linoleum floor tiles. At 41 years old, she possessed the kind of quiet, unyielding posture that made people forget she was in the room. She wore steel-rimmed glasses she never replaced because she could not afford better ones, the metal arms slightly tarnished where they rested against her temples. She was methodical. She was invisible within the newsroom hierarchy above her, and she preferred it that way. Invisibility granted her the uninterrupted silence required to do her job. Before her lay the previous week's obituaries, a stack of thin, ink-stained columns waiting to be clipped, categorized, and filed into the towering green steel cabinets that lined the walls. Miriam reached for her metal ruler and her shears. She worked with a practiced rhythm. Align the ruler, tear the excess paper, trim the edges, read the text, underline the key facts. She reached for her red pencil. The red pencil was her primary tool of navigation, a way to carve hard facts out of sentimental prose. She pulled the next clipping from the stack. Estelle Norbury, 82 years old. Miriam read the brief paragraph. It was standard copy, the kind she wrote half a dozen times a week. Estelle Norbury had passed away quietly. No surviving children, no surviving siblings. A solitary end to a quiet life. Miriam's eyes tracked down to the final lines, her red pencil hovering over the newsprint. Resident of the Lakeview Terrace Convalescent Home. Memorial services private. Estate to the Crestwood Benevolent Foundation. Miriam's hand stopped. The red pencil rested a fraction of an inch above the paper. She stared at the words, Crestwood Benevolent Foundation. The name was familiar. It was not the kind of familiarity that came from a major local charity like the United Way or the Catholic Diocese. It was a specific, mechanical familiarity. Her fingers remembered typing those exact syllables. She set the red pencil down. The basement was quiet, save for the low hum of the ventilation shafts. Miriam stood up, her chair scraping softly against the linoleum, and walked toward the banks of filing cabinets that held the paper's published history. She pulled the heavy drawer marked with the current year. The metal rollers shrieked briefly. She began to pull her own clip files for the previous 8 months. She did not need to search for the foundation by name. She searched her own memory of the obituaries she had written, the solitary deaths that had crossed her desk. She pulled the file for Wallace Finn, who had died 14 months prior, though she had reviewed his file more recently. She pulled the file for Ora Blackwell, who had died 2 years and 7 months ago. She pulled the file for Harold Cushing, who had died 3 years and 2 months ago. Miriam carried the files back to her desk. She opened them one by one, extracting the small, yellowing rectangles of newsprint. She laid the 4 obituary clippings side by side on her desk. The texture of the 4 obituary clippings spread on her desk, thin newsprint gone slightly soft at the edges from the morgue's humidity, felt fragile under her fingertips. She leaned over them, the steel rims of her glasses catching the harsh light of her desk lamp. Harold Cushing, died of cardiac failure. Resident of Lakeview Terrace Convalescent Home. Sole beneficiary, Crestwood Benevolent Foundation. Ora Blackwell, died of cardiac failure. Resident of Lakeview Terrace Convalescent Home. Sole beneficiary, Crestwood Benevolent Foundation. Wallace Finn, died of natural causes. Resident of Lakeview Terrace Convalescent Home. Sole beneficiary, Crestwood Benevolent Foundation. Estelle Norbury, died of natural causes. Resident of Lakeview Terrace Convalescent Home. Sole beneficiary, Crestwood Benevolent Foundation. Miriam opened her top drawer and took out a single blank index card. She picked up her red pencil. She wrote, 4 deaths. Beneath that, Lakeview Terrace. Beneath that, Crestwood Benevolent Foundation. The pattern was undeniable. 4 people, all residents of the same facility, all dying without immediate family nearby, all leaving their entire worldly estates to the exact same charitable entity. Cleveland in 1961 was a city of steel mills and union halls, its skyline perpetually hazed with furnace smoke drifting off the Cuyahoga River. Assisted living facilities, then called convalescent homes, were largely unregulated. They were staffed by practical nurses and run as private businesses with minimal oversight from the county health board. Elderly residents who signed power of attorney documents rarely understood the full legal consequences. Miriam knew this. She had seen the county's indifference firsthand. She stared at the index card. The red graphite stood out sharply against the white paper. She needed to know what the Crestwood Benevolent Foundation was. Miriam left the clippings on her desk and walked out of the morgue. She climbed the concrete stairwell to the city room on the 2nd floor. The atmosphere shifted immediately. The city room was a cavern of noise and motion, thick with cigarette smoke and the aggressive clatter of 50 typewriters striking platens simultaneously. Men in rolled-up sleeves shouted across desks. Telephones rang unanswered. Miriam moved through the chaos invisibly, a ghost in a gray wool skirt, navigating the narrow aisles until she reached the reference shelves at the back of the room. She pulled down the heavy, leather-bound volume of the Cleveland Metropolitan Area Directory. She hauled it to a standing desk and flipped to the C section. She ran her finger down the dense columns of tiny print. Crestview Apartments. Crestwood Auto Parts. Crestwood Bakery. Crestwood Lumber. There was no Crestwood Benevolent Foundation. She checked the philanthropic registers. She checked the county directory of registered charities. Nothing. The foundation had no local public presence whatsoever. It did not exist in the city of Cleveland, at least not in any way that could be looked up, visited, or telephoned. It existed only on the death notices submitted by the convalescent home. The absence of the foundation deepened her suspicion into something cold and hard. A charity that collects the life savings of the dead but has no address for the living was not a charity. It was a vault. Miriam closed the heavy directory. She knew what she had to do next, and she knew exactly how difficult it would be. The Plain Dealer was the paper of record, but its editors were cautious men who feared libel suits more than they loved truth. She walked across the newsroom toward the glass-partitioned office of Gordon Spiel. Spiel was 58 years old, an ex-police reporter who had lost his nerve and gained a management title. He had become permanently cautious after the paper settled a bruising libel suit in 1954, an event that had nearly cost him his pension. He sat behind his desk, reviewing a proof sheet with a blue pencil. On the corner of his blotter sat a framed photograph of his daughter's wedding, perfectly angled so that anyone sitting across from him would see it. A silent, silver-plated reminder of the quiet, respectable life he was protecting by never taking unnecessary risks. Miriam stood in the open doorway until Spiel looked up. "Miriam," he said, his voice carrying the gravel of a 3-pack-a-day habit. "What do you need? I'm pushing a deadline for the evening edition." Miriam stepped into the office. She did not sit down. She placed the 4 obituary clippings and her red-penciled index card directly on the center of his blotter, right over his proof sheet. 4 people died, Miriam said. She spoke in short, declarative sentences, her voice flat and even. They all lived at Lakeview Terrace Convalescent Home. They all left their entire estates to the Crestwood Benevolent Foundation. The foundation does not exist in the Cleveland City Directory. Spiel frowned. He looked down at the clippings. He read the index card. He looked at the clippings again. For a moment, the newsroom noise outside the glass seemed to fade. Then, Spiel raised his right hand. The sound of Spiel's 2-finger desk tap, a dry wooden knock that Miriam had learned to associate with the word no, echoed sharply in the small office. Tap, tap. "Old people die, Miriam," Spiel said, leaning back in his chair. That is what convalescent homes are for. They decline, they pass on, and if they don't have kids to fight over the silver, they leave their money to charity. It is a statistical likelihood, not a story. 4 identical beneficiaries from the same facility is not a statistic, Miriam said. It is a funnel. The foundation has no local address. Maybe it's based out of state. Maybe it's a religious outfit. I don't know, and frankly, I don't care. Spiel tapped the desk again, a single, final knock. You are an obituary writer. You are not a police reporter. If you want to accuse a convalescent home of stealing from the dead, you need 2 independent sources before I will authorize a single column inch. Do you have a source inside the home? Not yet. Do you have a source in the prosecutor's office? No. Then you have 4 pieces of paper and an active imagination. Spiel slid the clippings and the index card back across the desk toward her. Get back to the morgue. We have a circulation dip and the publisher is breathing down my neck. I am not risking a lawsuit from a private medical facility because you don't like their choice of charity. Miriam did not argue. Arguing with Gordon Spiel was like arguing with a brick wall. It only bruised your knuckles. She picked up her clippings. She picked up her index card. She turned and walked out of the office. The refusal was absolute. It forced Miriam into a narrow, lonely corridor of decision. If she pursued this on company time, Spiel would find out and fire her. If she dropped it, 4 people would be erased, their assets swallowed by a phantom entity, and whoever was operating the funnel would simply wait for the next resident to decline. Miriam returned to the basement. The sweet, chemical smell of the morgue welcomed her back. She sat at her desk and aligned her chair with the floor tiles. She rolled a fresh sheet of plain dealer letterhead into her typewriter. If the foundation was not registered in Ohio, it was registered somewhere else. And in Miriam's experience, entities that wished to hold money without answering questions incorporated in Delaware. She began to type. She wrote a formal letter to the Delaware Division of Corporations. She requested any and all registration documents, articles of incorporation, and listed officers for an entity known as the Crestwood Benevolent Foundation. She kept the language dry and bureaucratic. This was her first formal investigative action. When she finished, she pulled the paper from the carriage, folded it into thirds, and slid it into an envelope. She addressed it to Dover, Delaware. She did not run it through the plain dealer's postage meter. Doing so would leave a paper trail that Spiel could find. Instead, she opened her own purse, took out a book of stamps, and paid the 3-cent postage herself. She stood up, taking the envelope and her notebook, and walked up to the ground floor. The plain dealer lobby was a grand, echoing space of marble and brass, designed to impress upon visitors the weight and authority of the press. Along the far wall stood a row of wooden telephone booths. Miriam stepped into the last booth and pulled the heavy glass door shut, sealing herself in. She dropped a coin into the slot. The mechanical clunk was heavy and final. She dialed the number for the Lakeview Terrace Convalescent Home, reading it off her notebook. The line rang twice. "Lakeview Terrace," a woman's voice answered. The tone was bright, practiced, and entirely professional. "Good morning," Miriam said, her voice perfectly neutral. "I am updating some municipal records. Could you please provide me with the name of the facility's current administrator?" "Certainly," the receptionist said without hesitation. "That would be Nolan Greaves." Miriam wrote the name in her notebook. Nolan Greaves. "Thank you," Miriam said, and hung up the receiver. It was the first time the name entered her orbit. Nolan Greaves, a man who ran a facility where people died and left their money to ghosts. That evening, after her shift ended, Miriam did not go home. She walked through the October cold to the bus stop and rode the transit line to the Cuyahoga County Public Library. The library was a fortress of limestone and quiet, smelling of floor wax and old paper. Miriam bypassed the reading rooms and went directly to the Municipal Archives section. She pulled the heavy city directories, starting with the current year and working backward. She carried a stack of them to a long oak table and sat down. She looked up Nolan Greaves. She found him in the 1961 directory, Administrator, Lakeview Terrace. She opened the 1960 directory, Administrator, Lakeview Terrace. She worked her way back through the decade, 1959, 1958, 1957, 1956, 1955. He was listed in every single volume, always at the same facility, always with the same title. She checked the 1954 directory. He was not there. He had been the administrator since 1955, 6 years. There were no gaps in his employment, no sudden changes in his residential address, no flags of instability. He was, on paper, a perfectly ordinary, reliable citizen. This told Miriam something vital. The scheme, whatever its exact mechanics, had begun quietly. It was institutionalized. It was never publicly visible because Greaves had built it slowly, embedding it into the routine operations of the facility. Miriam closed the directories. She had one more name to check. A few days prior, while browsing the library's public legal notices out of professional habit, she had seen the probate filing for Estelle Norbury. She remembered a specific detail from that notice, the attorney of record who had filed the paperwork for the estate. She pulled the current Cleveland telephone directory and flipped to the P section. She ran her finger down the columns. Pruitt, Desmond, attorney at law. There it was, an office address on Euclid Avenue. Desmond Pruitt was not a phantom like the foundation. He was a practicing attorney, a real person with a listed telephone number and a physical office in the heart of the city's commercial district. Miriam wrote the address in her notebook. She packed up her things, returned the heavy volumes to the reference desk, and walked out into the night. The October cold in Cleveland was a physical force. It whipped off the unseen waters of Lake Erie, cutting through the heavy wool of Miriam's coat. The sky above the city was a bruised, starless purple, underlit by the distant, angry orange flares of the steel mills in the flats. The air tasted of sulfur and exhaust. Miriam walked along Euclid Avenue. The street was largely empty at this hour, the department stores and banks locked behind heavy iron grills. The street lamps cast dirty yellow halos on the pavement. She kept her head down against the wind, her sensible heels clicking a steady, solitary rhythm against the concrete. She approached the block where Desmond Pruitt's office was located. It was a narrow, pre-war brick building sandwiched between a larger bank and a closed haberdashery. The ground floor was dark. Miriam stopped on the opposite side of the street. She looked up. Against the gray, freezing canvas of the October street, a single window on the second floor was lit. The orange glow of Pruitt's second-floor window against the gray October street, the only lit window in the block, stood out like a beacon. Miriam checked her watch. It was 9 o'clock in the evening. Desmond Pruitt worked late. An attorney handling standard estate probates for convalescent home residents did not need to burn the midnight oil unless the paperwork required a level of privacy that daylight hours could not afford. The lit window told her two things. Pruitt was deeply involved in the mechanics of the estates, and his office was accessible during business hours if she ever needed to find him. She stood in the freezing wind for a full minute, memorizing the layout of the building, the location of the fire escape, the names on the brass directory plate bolted by the front door. Then, she turned and continued her walk home. Miriam's apartment was small and sparsely furnished, located in a brick walk-up on the near west side. It smelled faintly of radiator iron and the lavender soap she kept in the bathroom. She did not turn on the radio. She did not make tea. She took off her coat, hung it precisely on the wooden peg by the door, and walked to her small kitchen table. She sat down and opened her purse. She took out a notebook. This was not her spiral-bound reporter's notebook from the plain dealer. That notebook belonged to the paper, subject to Spiel's review if he ever demanded it. This was a personal notebook, bound in black leather, a notebook she kept strictly at home. She opened it to the first blank page. She took her red pencil from her purse. The investigation was no longer a theory floating in the humid air of the newspaper morgue. It had shape. It had names. It had geography. She pressed the red pencil to the paper and wrote a summary of everything she knew, stripping away the noise and leaving only the structural beams of the scheme. 4 deaths. 1 facility. 1 foundation. 1 attorney. 1 administrator. She looked at the 5 lines. They formed a closed loop, a perfect, self-sustaining ecosystem of theft. Nolan Greaves controlled the facility and the residents. Desmond Pruitt controlled the legal paperwork and the probate courts. The Crestwood Benevolent Foundation absorbed the money. And the 4 dead residents, Cushing, Blackwell, Finn, Norbury, were the fuel that kept the machine running. Miriam took her red pencil and drew a sharp, straight line under each name. Beneath Nolan Greaves, she wrote, "Confirm." Beneath Desmond Pruitt, she wrote, "Confirm." Beneath Crestwood Benevolent Foundation, she wrote, "Confirm." She closed the black notebook. She was organized. She was committed. The fear of Gordon Spiel, the fear of losing her job, the fear of the vast, indifferent legal machinery of the city, none of it mattered anymore. She had seen the pattern, and Miriam Voss was constitutionally incapable of looking away once a pattern had been recognized. She reached into her purse one last time and pulled out the envelope addressed to the Delaware Division of Corporations. She ran her thumb over the flap, feeling the dry adhesive. She brought it to her lips, licked it, and pressed it firmly shut, sealing the request inside. She stood up and walked to the front door of her apartment. She set the sealed envelope on the small wooden table beside the door, positioning it so she could not possibly leave in the morning without picking it up. She walked back to the kitchen table. She picked up her red pencil and carried it to the door, laying it down gently right next to the envelope. The envelope on the kitchen table beside her red pencil. It was a highly specific image, a quiet tableau in the dim light of her apartment. It meant the waiting was over. The investigation was no longer just thoughts in her head or clippings on a desk. It was a physical, irreversible act. Tomorrow, the letter would go into the mail. Tomorrow, the machinery of discovery would begin to turn. And whoever was sitting behind the orange glow of that second-floor window on Euclid Avenue would eventually have to answer for the dead. The heavy oak doors of the Cuyahoga County Probate Court swung shut behind Miriam Voss, sealing away the damp October chill of the Cleveland morning. The air inside the records room was entirely different from the street. It was stagnant, preserved, carrying the distinct, dusty wood smell of 1,000 forgotten lives filed away in alphabetical order. It was the scent of municipal finality. Miriam walked toward the central counter, her low-heeled shoes clicking against the marble floor in a steady, unhurried rhythm. Behind the counter stood Terrence Albu. 28 years old, a Korean War veteran who wore his ties slightly loosened and kept 3 thick dictionaries stacked neatly on the corner of his desk, Albu was a man who found comfort in the absolute certainty of public records. He possessed the genuine belief that information belonged to everyone, a rare philosophy in a city built on closed-door handshakes. "Good morning, Terrence," Miriam said, stopping at the counter. Albu looked up from a crossword puzzle, his left hand resting on the newspaper. A slight tremor vibrated through his fingers, a souvenir from a mortar shell on a frozen hillside he never discussed. He pulled his hand beneath the counter, a reflex he had never quite mastered. "Miriam, you're down here early."
"I need to pull 4 estate files,"
Miriam said, her voice a flat, declarative instrument. She slid a slip of paper across the polished wood. Harold Cushing, Ora Blackwell, Wallace Finn, Estelle Norbury. Albu looked at the names. A shadow of procedural anxiety crossed his face, tightening the corners of his mouth. He had already pulled the Wallace Finn file the previous afternoon, acting on a quiet, informal request Miriam had made over the telephone before she had the other 3 names. It was a minor breach of protocol, pulling a file without a signed requisition, but in the rigid bureaucracy of the Cuyahoga County Courthouse, minor breaches were the things that cost clerks their pensions. He produced the formal request form and slid it toward her. Miriam took her red pencil from her purse and signed her name on the bottom line. Albu watched the red lead drag across the paper, his hesitation palpable. He took the form, stamped it with the heavy mechanical date stamper, and turned toward the stacks without a word. He returned 10 minutes later carrying 4 thick accordion folders. He set them on the counter. The dry, aged material of the folders shed small flakes of brown cardboard onto the pristine surface of the wood.
Reading table 3 is empty,
Albu said quietly. Miriam gathered the folders against her chest.
Thank you.
She carried the files to the long oak table beneath the humming fluorescent tube lights. She sat down, arranged the 4 folders in chronological order of death, and opened the first one. For the next 3 hours, Miriam Voss did not leave the chair. She did not drink water. She did not look at the clock on the far wall. She simply read, her eyes moving methodically across the dense, legalistic type of the probate documents, her red pencil poised but unmoving. She began with Harold Cushing. She found the original will, drafted a decade earlier, leaving his modest savings to a nephew in Arizona. Then she found the amendment. It was dated 7 weeks before Cushing's death. The amendment revoked all prior instructions and named the Crestwood Benevolent Foundation as the sole beneficiary. Miriam turned the page. The amendment was witnessed by 2 signatures. She recognized neither name, but the employment listed beside them was identical. Lakeview Terrace Convalescent Home. She opened the file for Ora Blackwell. The pattern repeated with mechanical precision, an original will favoring a distant cousin, superseded by an amendment drafted 4 months before her death. The sole beneficiary was the Crestwood Benevolent Foundation. The witnesses were 2 different individuals, but their listed employer remained the same, Lakeview Terrace Convalescent Home. Miriam moved to Wallace Finn, then to Estelle Norbury. The architecture of the scheme laid itself bare beneath the harsh fluorescent light. In every instance, the will amendment was signed within the final 6 months of the resident's stay at the facility. In every instance, the witnesses were facility employees. But it was the physical documents themselves that held Miriam's attention. She laid the 4 amendments side by side on the reading table. They were not typed from scratch. They were printed templates, standard boilerplate legal forms with blank spaces left for the resident's name, the date, and the beneficiary. The words Crestwood Benevolent Foundation had been typed into the blank beneficiary line on all 4 documents. Miriam leaned closer, her steel-rimmed glasses slipping slightly down the bridge of her nose. She stared at the typed letters. The typeface was identical across all 4 amendments, but that was not what made her breath catch in the quiet room. It was the lowercase e. In the word benevolent, the lowercase e was distinctive. The metal key on the typewriter was worn and misaligned, causing the letter to print slightly high, floating a fraction of a hair above the baseline of the other letters. She checked the Cushing document, the elevated E. She checked the Blackwell document, the elevated E. Finn. Norbury. The same worn key, striking the ribbon with the exact same mechanical flaw, spanning a period of over 3 years. Miriam gathered the 4 amendments and walked back to the counter. Albu was reshelving a ledger. "Terrence," Miriam said. Albu turned. Miriam laid the 4 pages on the counter, pointing to the signature lines at the bottom of the templates. "The attorney of record on all 4 of these filings is Desmond Pruitt," Miriam said. "Is it unusual to see the same attorney handling 4 estates from the same convalescent home?" Albu looked at the names, his brow furrowing. Unusual? Not by itself. A lot of these facilities have a lawyer they recommend to families when it's time to get affairs in order. It's a pipeline. It's unseemly, maybe, but it's not illegal. Miriam tapped the beneficiary line with the eraser of her red pencil. Look at the typing. The fill-in for the foundation. Albu leaned over the counter, squinting at the documents.
The lowercase e,
Miriam said. Albu stared for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly. It prints high.
On all four,
Miriam said, spanning 3 years. Albu stood up straight, his hands resting flat on the counter. The slight tremor in his left hand was entirely still. 4 identical will templates, filled in by the exact same typewriter with the exact same worn key over 3 years. No, Miriam, that is not something I have seen before. That means the forms weren't typed at the facility. They were typed in the same office, on the same machine, waiting for a signature. His observation validated the cold knot of suspicion in her chest. It gave her a specific, physical detail to pursue. The scheme was not a series of opportunistic thefts. It was an assembly line. Miriam returned the files, thanked Albu, and walked out into the October wind. 2 days later, the mail arrived at Miriam's apartment. Among the utility bills was a heavy manila envelope bearing the return address of the Delaware Division of Corporations. Miriam took it to her kitchen table, sat down, and tore the flap open. She extracted a single, formal registration certificate. It confirmed the existence of the Crestwood Benevolent Foundation, incorporated 4 years prior. The stated purpose was broad and meaningless: the support of arts education for underprivileged children. But Miriam was not interested in the purpose. She scanned down to the officers of the corporation. There was only one name listed. The director of record was Edmund Harrow, with a registered address in Dover, Delaware. Miriam opened her notebook. She wrote the name Edmund Harrow in block letters. She spent the next 4 hours at the main branch of the public library. She pulled the telephone directories for Dover, Delaware. There was no Edmund Harrow. She pulled the city directories and the voter registration rolls for the greater Dover area. Nothing. She expanded her search to Cleveland, then to Columbus, then to Cincinnati. She checked every Ohio municipal directory available on the library's reference shelves. Edmund Harrow did not exist. He owned no property, he had no telephone, he cast no votes. Miriam sat in the quiet reference room, tapping her red pencil against her notebook. If the director of a foundation receiving tens of thousands of dollars in estate transfers could not be located, the identity was either a phantom or a ghost. She returned to her apartment and drafted a letter to the Ohio Bureau of Vital Statistics in Columbus. She requested a comprehensive search of death records for the name Edmund Harrow. She did not use plain dealer letterhead. She did not identify herself as a journalist. Instead, she framed the request as genealogical research, claiming Edmund Harrow was a lost great-uncle whose resting place her family wished to locate. It was a deliberate, strategic choice. Miriam was learning to operate in the shadows, realizing that official credentials would only trigger alarms in a system designed to protect itself. She sealed the letter, affixed a stamp, and dropped it in the corner mailbox before the sun went down. While she waited for Columbus to reply, Miriam turned her attention back to the facility. She needed a human element, a crack in the silence of the Lakeview Terrace Convalescent Home. The crack appeared in the form of Clara Ost. Clara Ost was a housekeeper who lived in Slavic Village, a neighborhood where the air perpetually smelled of boiled cabbage and the heavy, sulfurous industrial exhaust from the nearby steel mills. Miriam had learned of Ost through a neighbor who worked in the plain dealer's circulation department. The neighbor had mentioned, in passing, that Ost had been deeply upset about an argument she had witnessed at the convalescent home where she cleaned floors. Miriam took a bus to Slavic Village on a Tuesday afternoon. She found Clara Ost hanging laundry on a line strung across a narrow, concrete backyard. Ost was a woman in her late 50s, her hands red and raw from industrial detergents. Miriam introduced herself simply as a woman looking into the conditions at Lakeview Terrace. She did not hold a notebook. She stood in the cold wind, helping Ost pin wet bedsheets to the line, letting the silence stretch until the housekeeper felt compelled to fill it.
It's not a good place,
Ost said finally, her accent thick, her eyes fixed on the clothespins. They smile at the families in the front parlor, but in the back hallways it is different.
Did you know Wallace Finn?
Miriam asked quietly. Ost stopped moving. She looked at Miriam, her jaw tightening. Mr. Finn was a quiet man. He liked to read the paper. He didn't bother nobody.
I was told you saw something,
Miriam said.
an argument.
Ost looked toward the steel mills, the smokestacks bleeding gray into the overcast sky. 2 weeks before he died, I was mopping the corridor near the linen closet. Mr. Greaves, the administrator, he was in Mr. Finn's room. The door was open. Mr. Greaves was shouting. I never heard him raise his voice before, always so polite, that one. But he was shouting at Mr. Finn, telling him he had no choice, telling him it was already done. Miriam's pulse quickened. Did he mention a will? Did he mention money?
I don't know,
Ost said, shaking her head quickly. I moved away. I didn't want Mr. Greaves to see me listening. But Mr. Finn was crying, an old man crying like a child. 2 weeks later, he was dead. Miriam thanked Clara Ost and walked back to the bus stop, her mind racing. This was it. Direct coercion. Nolan Greaves standing over an elderly man, shouting him into submission, forcing him to sign away his duplex and his life savings. It was the narrative she needed to break the story wide open. For the next 10 days, Miriam pursued the Finn Greaves argument with a singular, exhausting focus. She needed a second source to corroborate Ost's account. She visited Lakeview Terrace twice, posing as a prospective family member looking for a room for a fictitious ailing aunt. She walked the corridors, memorizing the layout, noting the location of the linen closet Ost had mentioned. She managed to corner 2 different nursing aides during their shift changes, catching them at the bus stop down the street from the facility. Both aides were young, overworked, and nervous. Under Miriam's relentless declarative questioning, both confirmed that they had heard raised voices coming from Wallace Finn's room around the time Ost had specified. But what were they arguing about? Miriam pressed the second aide, a girl no older than 19, as they stood shivering in the November wind. Was it about his estate? His paperwork? The girl looked at Miriam, confused. Paperwork? No. Mr. Greaves was yelling because Mr. Finn threw a glass of water at him. Why? Because Mr. Greaves had the maintenance men take Mr. Finn's television set out of his room, the girl said, wrapping her thin coat tighter around herself. Mr. Greaves said it was too loud and disturbed the other patients. He moved it to the common room without asking. Mr. Finn was furious. He said it was his property. Mr. Greaves told him he had no choice, that it was already done. That's what the yelling was about. Miriam stood frozen on the sidewalk as the girl boarded the approaching bus. The coercion theory collapsed instantly, shattering into useless fragments. There was no argument over a will. There was no dramatic confrontation over an estate. It was an argument over a television set. Miriam walked the 2 miles back to her apartment in the biting cold. When she got inside, she did not take off her coat. She sat at the kitchen table, opened her black notebook, and found the page where she had mapped out the coercion theory. She took her red pencil and wrote the word television in capital letters across the center of the page. She pressed the tip of the red pencil against the paper and drew a single, hard line through the entire theory. The sound of the graphite striking through the word was sharp and violent in the quiet apartment. She pressed so hard, the pencil point tore slightly through the paper, leaving a jagged scar on the page beneath it. She had lost 2 weeks. 2 weeks of bus rides, of lying to receptionists, of standing in the freezing wind outside shift changes, all for a theory that amounted to nothing. She closed the notebook, the frustration sitting heavy and bitter in the back of her throat. The next morning, the mail brought a letter from Columbus. It was an official envelope from the Ohio Bureau of Vital Statistics. Miriam opened it carefully. Inside was a single sheet of paper bearing a pale blue letterhead. For the rest of her life, Miriam Voss would associate that specific shade of pale blue with the dry chemical smell of envelope glue and the sudden vertiginous sensation of a puzzle locking violently into place. The letter was brief. The genealogical search had yielded a result. Edmund Harrow had died in Youngstown, Ohio, 17 years ago at the age of 62. The cause of death was listed as industrial pneumoconiosis. The official death certificate number was provided at the bottom of the page. Miriam held the pale blue paper in her hands. The silence in her kitchen was absolute. The director of the Crestwood Benevolent Foundation, the man legally responsible for receiving over $150,000 in estate transfers over the past 3 years, had been buried in a Youngstown cemetery before the Korean War even began. The foundation was a shell. The identity was a fabrication built on the stolen records of a dead steelworker. And the only person with the legal expertise to construct such a phantom entity, to weave a dead man's identity into Delaware corporate filings, was the attorney who drafted the wills. Desmond Pruitt. Miriam gathered her evidence. She placed the 4 probated will amendments, the Delaware registration document, and the pale blue letter from the Bureau of Vital Statistics into a manila folder. She took the streetcar downtown, walked into the plain dealer building, and bypassed the morgue entirely. She walked straight up the stairs to the city desk. Gordon Spiel sat behind his desk, a cigarette burning forgotten in a glass ashtray. 58 years old, Spiel was an ex-police reporter who had lost his nerve after the paper settled a ruinous libel suit in 1954. He was a man who navigated by the avoidance of risk. He kept a framed photograph of his daughter's wedding prominently displayed on his desk, a prop he frequently referenced to remind aggressive reporters that he had a family to feed and a pension to protect.
Miriam?
Spiel said, looking up as she approached. "I thought you were filing the weekend obits."
I need 10 minutes,
Miriam said. She did not wait for an invitation. She sat in the wooden chair opposite his desk and opened the manila folder. She laid the documents out in front of him, exactly as she had laid them out on the reading table at the probate court. She walked him through the timeline, the 4 deaths, the identical will amendments, the worn lowercase e that proved the documents were typed on the same machine. Finally, she placed the pale blue letter from Vital Statistics on top of the Delaware registration. "The foundation receiving the estates is directed by a man named Edmund Harrow," Miriam said, her voice steady and relentless. "Edmund Harrow died in Youngstown 17 years ago. The administrator of the facility, Nolan Greaves, is feeding these residents to an attorney named Desmond Pruitt. Pruitt alters the wills, the residents die, and the money vanishes into a foundation run by a corpse." Spiel stared at the documents. He did not touch them. He reached out and tapped his desktop twice with his index and middle fingers. It was his tell. It was the physical manifestation of a door closing. "Miriam," Spiel said, his voice taking on the patronizing, patient tone of a teacher explaining a simple concept to a slow student. "What exactly do you have here?"
I have proof of a coordinated fraud,
Miriam said. "You have 4 legal wills, probated and accepted by the county court," Spiel countered. "You have a typewriter key that prints high. Do you know how many law offices use standard estate templates? Do you know how many typewriters in this city have a misaligned E? It's circumstantial nonsense." "And the dead man?" Miriam pointed to the blue letter. "The director of the foundation?" "A discrepancy in a Delaware corporate filing," Spiel said, leaning back in his chair. "That is a matter for the Delaware Attorney General or the Ohio Tax Board. It is not a story for the plain dealer. You are accusing a licensed attorney and a respected facility administrator of a massive criminal conspiracy based on a typo and a genealogical mix-up." "It is not a mix-up, Gordon. It is a fabricated identity." "Prove it," Spiel said sharply. "Give me a source on the record. Give me a witness who saw Pruitt forge the documents. Give me a nurse who says Greaves ordered the wills changed. You spent 2 weeks chasing a rumor about an argument over a television set, Miriam. You have paper, but you have no people. And without people, You have a libel suit waiting to happen." He gestured toward the framed photograph of his daughter. "I am not putting this paper in the crosshairs of a Euclid Avenue law firm because you found a worn typewriter key." Gordon. "The answer is no," Spiel said, his voice dropping to a register of absolute finality. "I told you before, 4 deaths in a convalescent home is a statistical likelihood. You need 2 independent, on-the-record sources before I authorize a single column inch. Now gather your files and get back to the morgue. The Sunday edition needs the obits filed by 3. Miriam looked at Spiel for a long moment. She did not argue. She did not plead. She simply gathered the documents, placed them back into the manila folder, and stood up. She walked down the stairs to the basement. The morgue was quiet, smelling of old newsprint and binding glue. She sat at her desk, surrounded by the towering metal filing cabinets that held the recorded history of the city's dead. She sat perfectly still for 20 minutes. The institutional machinery of the plain dealer had failed her. The paper would not protect her, and it would not back her. If she was going to break the scheme, she had to force a mistake. She had to step out of the archives and into the line of fire. Miriam opened her desk drawer and took out a fresh, blank index card. She picked up her red pencil. She pressed the lead against the thick cardstock and wrote 4 words in sharp, precise letters. "Find Desmond Pruitt directly." She underlined the sentence twice. The decision was made. The era of document research was over. The era of personal confrontation had begun. 10 miles away, on the east side of the city, the afternoon sun slanted through the blinds of the administrator's office at the Lakeview Terrace Convalescent Home. Nolan Greaves sat behind his immaculate mahogany desk. 55 years old, compact and impeccably dressed in a tailored gray suit, Greaves exuded an aura of calm, clinical authority. He was a man who understood the power of aesthetics. He kept a crystal bowl of wrapped peppermint candies on the corner of his desk, a prop designed to disarm nervous families touring the facility. He used first names immediately, he never raised his voice, and he maintained a facility that smelled of lemon polish rather than ammonia. The telephone on his desk rang. Greaves picked up the receiver. Nolan Greaves. "Mr. Greaves, I'm sorry to disturb you." The receptionist's voice crackled through the earpiece. "I was just going through the visitor log for the week, and I thought I should mention something." "Go ahead, Betty," Greaves said, his tone warm and encouraging. "There was a woman who came in twice last week. She said she was looking for a room for her aunt. But she didn't ask any of the usual questions about the meal plans or the visiting hours. She just wanted to walk the corridors, and she asked a lot of questions about the staff schedules." Greaves's eyes drifted toward the locked filing cabinet in the corner of his office. "Did she leave a name?" "She wrote down Smith in the logbook, but she didn't leave a telephone number," Betty said. "And, well, she called the front desk twice a few weeks ago, just asking for the name of the administrator. I gave her your name, of course. I didn't think anything of it at the time, but seeing her wandering around the halls, it just felt odd." Greaves reached out and picked up one of the wrapped peppermints from the crystal bowl. He turned it slowly between his thumb and forefinger, feeling the crinkle of the cellophane. "Thank you, Betty," Greaves said smoothly. "You did the right thing by telling me. It's probably just an anxious niece trying to do her homework. Families get very nervous about these transitions. But if she calls again, or if she comes back, please let me know immediately. I'd like to speak with her myself." "Of course, Mr. Greaves." Greaves placed the receiver gently back onto the cradle. He did not move for a long time. The silence in the office was absolute, broken only by the faint, rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. He did not know her name. He did not know who she worked for, or what she had found. But Nolan Greaves was a man who had survived by anticipating the weather before the storm arrived. A woman asking for his name, touring his facility under false pretenses, mapping the schedules of his staff. He dropped the peppermint back into the crystal bowl. He was not alarmed. Panic was the luxury of the unprepared, and Greaves was never unprepared. But as he looked out the window at the darkening Cleveland sky, his eyes narrowed into cold, calculating slits. He was alert. He was being watched. And whoever was watching him was about to find out that the machinery of Lakeview Terrace was designed to crush anything that got caught in its gears. The wind coming off Lake Erie carried the bitter, metallic taste of the steel mills, a fine industrial grit that settled over Euclid Avenue and coated the windshields of parked cars. Miriam Voss sat on a freezing stone bench outside a transit stop, her coat collar turned up against the October chill. For 90 minutes, she watched the heavy brass-handled doors of the office building across the street. She let 4 eastbound transit coaches blow past in clouds of diesel exhaust, ignoring the questioning looks of the drivers. She did not read a newspaper. She did not smoke. She simply watched the doors through her steel-rimmed glasses, waiting for the directory photograph to become a living man. At 10 minutes past 9, Desmond Pruitt emerged. He was 60 years old, wearing a tailored wool overcoat that fit a little too perfectly, the kind of garment purchased to project an authority the wearer did not entirely possess. Miriam recognized him immediately. She stood up, her joints stiff from the cold, and fell into step half a block behind him. Pruitt walked with a measured, deliberate stride, heading east, away from the commercial center. He turned into a narrow diner squeezed between a haberdashery and a shoe repair shop. Miriam waited 30 seconds before pushing through the glass door. The diner was warm, smelling of burnt coffee, frying grease, and wet wool. Pruitt was seated at the far end of the Formica counter, his overcoat neatly folded on the stool beside him. He was stirring a cup of black coffee. Miriam walked down the length of the counter and sat 2 stools away. She did not look at him immediately. She ordered a coffee from the waitress, waited until the thick ceramic mug was set in front of her, and then turned her head. The smell of Pruitt's aftershave drifted across the empty stool between them, a sharp cedar and alcohol scent that cut through the diner's grease. It was a calculated fragrance, the smell of deliberate composure. "Mr. Pruitt?" Miriam said. Her voice was flat, carrying no interrogative upward lilt. Pruitt stopped stirring his coffee. He did not drop his spoon. He did not gasp or jerk his head. He went entirely still. His hand hovered an inch above the saucer, his breathing shallowing out until his chest barely moved beneath his tailored suit. It was an absolute, unnatural paralysis, and to Miriam, it was far more alarming than if he had reacted with sudden anger. It was the stillness of a man who had rehearsed this exact disaster in the dark. "I am Miriam Voss," she said, speaking in the short, declarative sentences she favored. "I write for the Plain Dealer. I want to ask you about the estate of Estelle Norbury, and Wallace Finn, and the Crestwood Benevolent Foundation." Pruitt slowly lowered his spoon to the saucer. It made a soft, precise clink. He turned his head to look at her. His eyes were flat and unblinking. "While I appreciate the diligence that your profession undoubtedly requires," Pruitt said, his voice a careful, modulated baritone, "the documents to which you refer, concerning as they do the private estate preparations of various clients who have sought my counsel, are entirely protected by the strictures of professional privilege, and therefore are not subjects that I am at liberty to discuss." He did not wait for a response. He reached into his trouser pocket, withdrew a leather coin purse, and placed a dime and a nickel on the counter. He picked up his overcoat, draped it over his arm without putting it on, and walked out of the diner. He had not taken a single sip of his coffee. Miriam watched the door swing shut. She took a sip of her own coffee, feeling the scalding heat against her teeth. Pruitt's controlled exit told her everything she needed to know. He had not asked who Finn or Norbury were. He had not asked what the Crestwood Benevolent Foundation was. He had deployed a perfectly constructed, grammatically complex shield of subordinate clauses and walked away. He had anticipated being approached. Miriam left her untouched coffee on the counter and walked back out into the cold. By the time she reached her desk in the basement morgue of the Plain Dealer building, her mind was already pivoting. Pruitt was a fortress. He was an attorney who understood exactly how to hide behind the law. If she pushed him, he would simply retreat further into the sanctity of client privilege. She needed to shift her focus away from the paperwork of the dead and toward the mechanics of their dying. 4 deaths, all certified as natural causes, all occurring at the same facility where the administrator, Nolan Greaves, controlled the nursing logs and the access to the residents. But Greaves could not sign a death certificate. Pruitt could not sign a death certificate. They needed a physician, and all 4 certificates in the probate files had been signed by the same man, Dr. Felix Caro. Miriam pulled her rotary telephone across the scarred wood of her desk. She dialed the number for the Cuyahoga County Medical Society.
Records, this is Francis.
A voice answered. Francis, it's Miriam Voss. There was a brief, heavy silence on the line. 3 years ago, Francis had come to the Plain Dealer lobby in tears. Her younger brother, a clerk at a local shipping firm, had been caught altering invoices to cover a gambling debt. The police had been called, a report filed, but the firm had ultimately declined to press charges. The item had landed on Miriam's desk for the police blotter. Francis had begged her to kill the 2-line brief, knowing it would destroy her brother's chances of finding another job. Miriam had looked at the weeping woman, looked at the minor dollar amount, and quietly dropped the slip of paper into her wastebasket. She had never asked Francis for anything in return. Until today.
Miriam,
Francis said, her voice dropping to a whisper.
how are you?
I need a favor, Francis. I need you to look up a physician in the county registry, Dr. Felix Caro. I need to know if there have been any formal complaints filed against his license, any disciplinary actions, or any registered affiliations with a facility called the Lakeview Terrace Convalescent Home. Miriam, you know I'm not supposed to give out disciplinary records over the phone to the press.
I'm not the press today, Francis.
Miriam said evenly.
I'm just a woman asking a friend to read a piece of paper.
Francis exhaled slowly.
Give me until tomorrow afternoon. I have to pull the physical cards from the basement archive. Thank you,
Miriam said, and hung up. She spent the rest of the day clipping obituaries, her red pencil moving mechanically over the newsprint, her mind entirely consumed by the architecture of Lakeview Terrace. The next afternoon, at exactly 3 o'clock, her telephone rang. There are no formal complaints against Dr. Caro, Francis said immediately, her voice tight with the anxiety of breaking protocol. His license is clean. No malpractice suits registered with the society. Miriam felt a cold spike of disappointment. Nothing at all?
I didn't say nothing,
Francis corrected. You asked about affiliations. The County Medical Society requires physicians to disclose ongoing financial contracts with private medical facilities. It's on his public registration card. Dr. Caro is listed as a contract physician for Lakeview Terrace. He receives a monthly retainer. Miriam grabbed her red pencil.
How much?
$40 a month, paid directly by the facility.
Since when?
Miriam asked, her knuckles turning white around the receiver. The contract was registered in April of 1957, Francis said. Miriam stopped breathing for a second.
Are you sure about that year, Francis? 1957?
It's written right here in black ink. April 1957. Does that help you, Miriam?
Yes,
Miriam said softly.
It helps me more than you know. Thank you, Francis. We're square.
Miriam hung up the phone. She opened her personal notebook and looked at the timeline she had constructed. Harold Cushing, the first of the 4 victims, had died 2 years and 7 months ago. That was early 1959. Dr. Caro's retainer with Lakeview Terrace had begun in April 1957, 2 full years before the first of the 4 deaths. Miriam stared at the date, underlining it 3 times with her red pencil until the paper nearly tore. The implication was staggering. This was not a crime of opportunity. Greaves and Pruitt had not simply noticed that wealthy residents were dying and decided to exploit the paperwork after the fact. The scheme and the physician relationship had been established together years in advance. They had built the machinery, put the doctor on the payroll, and then waited for the right residents to walk through the doors. It was premeditated. It was a slaughterhouse disguised as a sanctuary. She needed someone on the inside. At 4 o'clock, Miriam left the plain dealer building and drove her rusted Plymouth out to the east side. She parked on the street a block away from Lakeview Terrace. This was her third visit to the facility. The first 2 times, she had posed as a prospective family member, wandering the halls, listening to the forced cheerfulness of the staff, trying to verify the rumor of an argument between Wallace Finn and Nolan Greaves. That had cost her 2 weeks and yielded nothing but a dead end about a television set. Today, she was not hiding. Miriam walked through the front doors of Lakeview Terrace, her sensible heels clicking sharply against the polished linoleum. The air smelled of industrial floor wax and boiled vegetables. She approached the front desk. The receptionist, a young woman with heavily sprayed hair, looked up with a practiced smile. "May I help you?" Miriam reached into her purse and placed her plain dealer press card on the counter. "My name is Miriam Voss. I am a reporter for the Plain Dealer. I would like to speak with any available nursing staff regarding the facility's standard care procedures and medication protocols." The receptionist's smile vanished instantly. The color drained from her face, leaving her rouge looking garish and artificial. She stared at the press card as if it were a live grenade. You need to leave," the receptionist stammered, her hand dropping beneath the counter, likely reaching for a telephone to call Greaves. "We don't speak to reporters. You have to leave right now or I'm calling the police." "That won't be necessary," Miriam said calmly. She retrieved her press card, dropped it back into her purse, and turned around. She walked out the front doors at the same measured pace she had entered. She did not go to her car. Instead, she walked around the perimeter of the manicured lawn, slipping into the shadows of the large oak trees that bordered the employee parking lot in the back. She checked her watch. It was 4:40. The day shift would be ending soon. Miriam stood in the biting cold, her hands thrust deep into her coat pockets, watching the heavy metal door at the rear of the building. At 5 o'clock, the door swung open, and a stream of women in white uniforms began to exit, their shoulders slumped with the exhaustion of an 11-hour shift. Miriam scanned the faces until she saw her. Ruth Ann Solich. Ruth Ann was 34, broad-shouldered and heavy-stepping. She wore a thick wool cardigan over her uniform, and Miriam immediately noticed her shoes, white nursing shoes with the laces removed and replaced by elastic bands, the desperate modification of a woman who spent too many hours on her feet to bother tying knots. Miriam stepped out from the shadow of the oak tree and intercepted Ruth Ann halfway down the row of parked cars. "Ruth Ann Solich," Miriam said. Ruth Ann stopped. Her eyes darted to Miriam, then quickly scanned the parking lot to see who else was watching. She saw the notebook in Miriam's hand. She saw the press card Miriam had pinned to the lapel of her coat. "I don't know you," Ruth Ann said, her voice tight. She tried to step around Miriam, her elastic-laced shoes scuffing against the asphalt. Miriam did not physically block her path, but she stepped sideways, keeping herself in Ruth Ann's line of sight. She did not introduce herself. She did not offer small talk. She asked only one question, her voice cutting through the cold evening air with absolute precision. "Did Wallace Finn receive his prescribed medications during his final 2 weeks?" Ruth Ann stopped walking. She froze, her hand halfway to the handle of her battered Ford sedan. The wind whipped across the parking lot, rattling the bare branches of the oak trees. Ruth Ann did not turn around to face Miriam. She stood perfectly rigid, staring at the window glass of her car. The silence stretched. It was a heavy, suffocating silence. Miriam watched the tension radiating through the muscles of Ruth Ann's broad back. She was waiting for a denial, She was waiting for Ruth Ann to say, "Yes, of course he did," or, "I don't know what you're talking about." Ruth Ann said neither. After a long, agonizing pause, Ruth Ann lowered her hand from the door handle. She spoke to the window glass, her voice trembling with a profound, exhausted terror. "I have a son at home." She pulled the door handle, slid into the driver's seat, and pulled the door shut. The sound was a heavy American car door thud, a deep, metallic slam that ended the conversation with absolute finality. The Ford's engine roared to life, coughing blue smoke into the cold air, and Ruth Ann Solik drove out of the parking lot without ever looking back in the rearview mirror. Miriam stood alone on the asphalt. The exhaust fumes drifted past her face. She pulled her notebook from her pocket, her fingers numb from the cold. Ruth Ann's response was a confession wrapped in a plea for mercy. It was neither a denial nor a confirmation, but a direct reference to her own vulnerability. It meant she had countersigned something she knew was wrong. It meant she was trapped. Miriam uncapped her pen and wrote 4 fragmented sentences on the lined paper. Solich knows. Afraid. Son, come back. The next morning, Miriam walked into the chaotic noise of the plain dealer city room. Typewriters clattered like machine gun fire, and a thick haze of cigarette smoke hung beneath the fluorescent lights. She bypassed her desk in the basement and walked directly to the elevated desk of Gordon Spiel, the managing editor. Spiel was 58, an ex-police reporter who had lost his nerve after a devastating libel suit nearly bankrupted the paper in 1954. He was a man who managed risk, not news. He sat behind his desk, a framed photograph of his daughter's wedding positioned prominently next to his ashtray, a prop he frequently referenced when reporters pushed him to take dangerous leaps. Miriam dropped her notebook and a copy of the County Medical Society registration card onto the center of his blotter. 4 deaths, Gordon, Miriam said, skipping the pleasantries. All certified by the same physician, Dr. Felix Caro. I pulled his registration. He's on a $40 a month retainer from Lakeview Terrace. The retainer started in 1957, 2 years before the first resident died. He's on the payroll. Spiel looked at the document. He did not pick it up. He looked at Miriam, his jaw tightening. He raised his right hand and tapped his index and middle fingers twice against the wooden desktop. It was his physical tell, the gesture he always made right before he killed the story. A retainer is standard for contracted physicians, Miriam, Spiel said, his voice a gravelly monotone. It keeps them on call for emergencies. It does not imply fraud. It certainly doesn't imply murder. It implies a financial relationship that compromises his objectivity when signing 4 death certificates for residents who left their entire estates to a foundation controlled by the facility's administrator, Miriam countered, her voice remaining perfectly level. It's a statistical likelihood, Spiel said, leaning back in his chair. Old people die in convalescent homes. That's what the homes are for. Where is your proof that anything unnatural happened? Where is your proof that medications were withheld? I spoke to one of the floor nurses yesterday, Ruth Ann Solik. I asked her point blank if Wallace Finn received his medications. Spiel raised an eyebrow. And what did she say? She said she has a son at home, and then she fled in terror. Spiel stared at her for a long moment. Then he sighed, a sound of profound exhaustion. Miriam, you have a doctor on a standard medical retainer. You have a nurse who mentioned her child and drove away. You have a foundation in Delaware that we can't look at. You do not have a story. You have a libel suit waiting to happen. He tapped the desk twice again. Bring me proof that medications were withheld. Bring me a document, or bring me a witness who will go on the record. Until then, do not bring this to my desk again. Miriam picked up her documents. She did not argue. She turned and walked back to the stairwell, her face an unreadable mask. That night, Miriam sat alone in the small kitchen of her apartment. The fluorescent light fixture above the table had a loose tube. Every few minutes it flickered, casting a brief, harsh, blue-white pulse across the room. She cleared away her dinner dishes and laid out her index cards, her red pencil, and a fresh pad of paper. The apartment was entirely silent, save for the hum of the refrigerator. She needed to see the machine in its entirety. She needed to map the anatomy of the kill. She began to write, constructing the scheme on paper for the first time exactly as she now understood it. Step 1. Greaves and Pruitt identify residents who are cognitively declining, isolated from family, and possess substantial liquid assets or property. Step 2. Pruitt drafts amended wills, naming the Crestwood Benevolent Foundation as the sole beneficiary. The wills are witnessed by facility employees loyal to Greaves. Step 3. Greaves verbally instructs his nursing staff to reduce or entirely withhold prescribed life-sustaining medications. No written orders are given. Step 4. The resident declines and dies. Step 5. Dr. Caro, insulated by his monthly retainer, signs the death certificate, citing natural causes, cardiac failure, respiratory arrest. Step 6. Pruitt files the wills in probate court. The assets transfer to the foundation in Delaware. Miriam stared at the sequence. It was brilliant in its banality. It weaponized the natural frailty of the elderly and the bureaucratic indifference of the state. It left no bloody fingerprints, only properly stamped forms. She took her red pencil. At the very top of the legal pad, she wrote 2 words in block capital letters. Deliberate neglect. She pressed the pencil down hard, drawing a thick red line under the words. She drew a second line. The graphite tip snapped under the pressure, skittering across the table, but the words remained, stark and undeniable in the flickering blue-white light. Across the city, in the affluent suburb of Shaker Heights, Nolan Greaves sat in his leather armchair, a glass of mineral water resting on the side table. The house was quiet. He picked up the telephone receiver and dialed a Euclid Avenue number. Desmond Pruitt answered on the 4th ring. Pruitt. Desmond, it's Nolan. Greaves's voice was smooth, carrying the same polite, soothing cadence he used with the families of his residents. He never raised his voice. He never sounded afraid. In his office, Pruitt reached into his left desk drawer and pulled out a silver flask. He unscrewed the cap and took a slow pull of rye whiskey. Good evening, Nolan. To what do I owe the pleasure? We had a minor incident in the parking lot this afternoon, Greaves said, picking up a piece of lint from his trousers. A reporter from the Plain Dealer approached one of my floor nurses, Ruth Ann Solik. The reporter was asking questions about Wallace Finn's medication. Pruitt stopped with the flask halfway to his mouth. The silence on the line hummed with sudden, electric tension. Did the nurse speak to her? Pruitt asked, his subordinate clauses temporarily vanishing in the face of a direct threat. No, Ruth Ann is a loyal employee. She understands her situation. She got in her car and left. Greaves paused, taking a sip of his mineral water. But it means the reporter is no longer just looking at public records. She is actively probing the staff. Which brings me to a question, Desmond. Ask it, Pruitt said, his voice tightening. That sealed envelope you keep, Greaves said softly. The one you mentioned to me last year, the one I know nothing about. Could it become a problem? Pruitt had wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. He looked at the locked bottom drawer of his desk. Given that the reporter in question clearly possesses no actual sources, or else the story would already be running in the morning edition, I would suggest that your concerns regarding any hypothetical documents in my possession are entirely premature. The envelope is an insurance policy, Nolan. It protects both of us by ensuring mutual stability. I see, Greaves said. He did not sound convinced, but he did not press the issue. Just be sure your house is in order, Desmond, and I will manage mine. But I need you to do something for me. I need you to make certain that the nursing logs for all 4 of those residents cannot be subpoenaed by any county authority. Find a legal mechanism to seal them. Pruitt took another drink of the rye. The alcohol burned hot in his chest.
That is not my department, Nolan. I manage the estates. I manage the foundation filings. You manage the facility. If the logs are a vulnerability, that is an operational failure on your end, not a legal one on mine.
Just look into it, Desmond, Greaves said, his voice dropping a fraction of an octave, the polite veneer thinning just enough to reveal the steel beneath. Have a good night. Greaves hung up the phone. He sat in the quiet of his living room, his mind calculating variables, isolating threats. He would have to deal with Ruth Ann Solik, and he would have to deal with Miriam Voss. The next morning, Miriam walked down the stairs of her apartment building to the small vestibule where the brass mailboxes lined the wall. She unlocked her box and pulled out a stack of envelopes, an electric bill, a circular from a local grocer, and a plain white envelope. Miriam stopped. She held the white envelope up to the dim light of the vestibule. There was no return address. The postmark was local, stamped late the previous evening. She ran her thumb over the paper. It was thin, cheap material, the kind sold in drugstore packs of 25 for a dime. It was the kind of paper that absorbed ink poorly and left absolutely no identifying impression from a pen pressing on the sheet above it. Miriam slid her fingernail under the flap and tore it open. Inside was a single sheet of the same cheap paper, folded once. She unfolded it. There was no handwriting. There was only a single line of text, struck by a typewriter with a fresh ribbon. The logs for Finn and Norbury were rewritten after the deaths. A friend. Miriam stared at the typed letters. The hallway around her seemed to fall away, the ambient noise of the street outside fading into a dull roar in her ears. Rewritten after the deaths. She read the sentence again, her heart hammering against her ribs. This was it. This was the fracture in the machine. Gordon Spiel had demanded proof of withheld medications. He had demanded a source. Miriam did not have the physical logs yet, but she now had the confirmation she needed. Someone inside Lakeview Terrace was watching. Someone inside was terrified of Nolan Greaves, terrified of the machinery of the facility. But their conscience had finally outweighed their fear. They were afraid enough to hide behind cheap drugstore paper and an anonymous signature. But they were brave enough to point her toward the buried bodies. Miriam carefully folded the letter and slipped it into her coat pocket. She stepped out onto the sidewalk, the cold October wind hitting her face. The investigation was no longer just a theory built on index cards and probate files. It was real. It was bleeding, and the walls of Lakeview Terrace were beginning to crack. The wind coming off Lake Erie carried the bitter metallic taste of the steel mills, a heavy October chill that stripped the leaves from the maples and drove the early morning foot traffic into the recessed doorways of Lorraine Avenue. Miriam Voss walked the last 3 blocks to the diner with her collar turned up against the damp cold. It was 6:45. The streetlights were still burning, casting long, pale shadows across the cracked pavement. She pulled open the heavy glass door of the diner. Instantly, she was hit by the smell of the Lorraine Avenue diner, fried onions and burnt coffee, a warmth that was almost aggressive after the cold street. The air inside was thick with cigarette smoke and the clatter of heavy ceramic mugs against formica. Miriam bypassed the counter and walked directly to the back of the narrow room, sliding into a corner booth where the vinyl was patched with silver tape. A waitress in a faded yellow uniform dropped a menu on the table. Miriam ordered coffee black and nothing else. When the coffee arrived, she wrapped her cold hands around the mug. She did not open her purse. She did not take out her notebook or her red pencil. She had decided this during the sleepless hours of the night. Ruth Ann Solik was a woman balancing on the edge of a razor, terrified of her employer and burdened by a conscience she could no longer afford. The visible presence of a reporter taking notes, documenting her every hesitation, would shut her down. Miriam would have to trust her memory for the first pass. At 7:05, the bell above the door jingled. Ruth Ann Solik stepped inside. She was not wearing her uniform. She wore a heavy, dark wool coat, and a plain gray skirt, but Miriam noticed immediately that she was still wearing her white nursing shoes, the laces replaced by elastic because she was on her feet 11 hours a day. Ruth Ann scanned the room, her broad shoulders tense, her eyes darting past the mill workers at the counter until she saw Miriam in the back booth. Ruth Ann walked over and slid into the opposite side of the booth. She did not take off her coat. She kept her hands buried deep in her pockets.
"I shouldn't be here,"
Ruth Ann said. Her voice was barely above a whisper, tight and strained. "You sent the note," Miriam said. It was a statement, not a question. She kept her own voice level, devoid of pressure. Ruth Ann looked down at the Formica table. "I have a 14-year-old son at home. If I lose this job, I don't have a husband to fall back on. The county doesn't care why you can't pay your rent. Nolan Greaves is going to lose his facility," Miriam said quietly. "When the state looks at the probate filings, they are going to look at the medical records. The people who tell the truth before the state arrives are the people who get to keep their nursing licenses." Ruth Ann closed her eyes. The exhaustion in her face was absolute, a deep, bruising fatigue that went far beyond the physical toll of her shifts. "It was Mr. Finn," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "And Mrs. Norbury. The others, I wasn't on their rotation at the end. But Finn and Norbury, I was there." Miriam did not move. She let the silence pull the rest of the words out of the woman. "The medication administration logs," Ruth Ann continued, opening her eyes and staring at Miriam's coffee mug. "Mr. Greaves has a policy. If a resident is asleep, or if they refuse their medication, we are instructed not to force them. We are told to leave the space on the log blank for that shift, so the next nurse knows the dose wasn't given. He said it was for their comfort." "But the doses were prescribed by Dr. Caro," Miriam said. "Yes, heart medication for Mrs. Norbury, blood thinners and digitalis for Mr. Finn, life-saving medications." Ruth Ann swallowed hard. They weren't refusing them. They were confused, yes, but they would take them if you sat with them. "Mr. Greaves told us not to sit with them. He said it agitated them. He told us to leave the spaces blank." "And after they died?" Miriam asked, her tone perfectly flat, betraying none of the adrenaline surging through her chest. "The logs were altered," Ruth Ann said, the words rushing out now as if she were purging poison from her lungs. "I saw the binders 2 days after Mrs. Norbury passed. The blank spaces I left? They were filled in. Entries showing the doses were given. But they were written in a different pen. Blue ink, but a different brand, a thicker line. And the handwriting." "Whose handwriting?" "Mr. Greaves's," Ruth Ann said. "He tried to make it look like the standard block lettering we use, but I know his handwriting. He loops his capital letters. He filled in the blanks to make it look like they received every dose right up until the end." Miriam processed the mechanics of the fraud. "Facility procedure requires counter-signatures," she said. Ruth Ann flinched, pulling her coat tighter around herself. At the end of the week, the shift supervisor has to countersign the master log. I was the supervisor for that wing. Mr. Greaves called me into his office. He had the logbook open, but he had his hand over the daily entry columns. He just pointed to the bottom line and told me to sign. "And you signed it?" "I have a son," Ruth Ann repeated, her voice cracking. "I knew what he was doing. I understood it the moment I saw his hand covering the dates. But I signed it. I haven't slept a full night since Estelle Norbury died 4 months ago. Every time I close my eyes, I see her struggling to breathe, and I see my own signature at the bottom of that page." "I need the physical logs," Miriam said. "I need to put them in front of a handwriting expert." Ruth Ann shook her head frantically. "You can't! They're locked in the records room behind the nurse's station. It's a solid door, dead-bolted. Mr. Greaves controls the only key. He never lets it out of his sight." "Can you give me the exact dates?" Miriam asked. "The exact pages?" "Wallace Finn," Ruth Ann said without hesitation, the details burned into her memory.
The second and third weeks of his final month, pages 42 through 47 in his binder. Estelle Norbury, the last 10 days, pages 81 through 85. The blue ink is darker on those lines. If you look at them under a good light, you can see where his pen pressed harder than mine.
Miriam committed the numbers to memory. 42 through 47, 81 through 85.
Thank you, Ruth Ann,
she said. Ruth Ann stood up, sliding out of the booth. She looked terrified, as if the act of speaking the truth had stripped away her only armor.
Don't use my name, she pleaded. Please. If he finds out I talked to you, he'll ruin me.
Go to work, Miriam said. Act exactly as you always do. Miriam watched the broad-shouldered woman walk out of the diner and disappear into the gray morning. She sat in the booth for another 10 minutes, drinking the bitter coffee, mentally organizing the architecture of the story. She had the motive, the Crestwood Benevolent Foundation and its fabricated director. She had the method, the identical will templates and the physician retainer. And now she had the mechanism of death, deliberate neglect covered up by falsified nursing logs. She left a dime on the table and walked out into the cold. By 8:30, Miriam was sitting at her desk in the basement morgue of the Plain Dealer building. The smell of old newsprint and binding glue, usually a comfort to her, barely registered. She rolled a fresh sheet of copy paper into her heavy Underwood typewriter and began to strike the keys. She wrote the most complete version of the story she had yet assembled. She wrote in short, declarative sentences, stripping away all adjectives, letting the brutal weight of the facts carry the narrative. She detailed the 4 deaths. She named Nolan Greaves and Desmond Pruitt. She exposed the fictitious Edmund Harrow identity. She documented Dr. Felix Caro's monthly retainer and, carefully protecting Ruth Ann's identity, she described the falsified medication administration logs, citing a facility employee who witnessed the altered handwriting. It took her 2 hours. When she pulled the final page from the carriage, her hands were covered in black ink from the ribbon. She stacked the pages, tapped them square against the desk, and slid them into a heavy manila envelope. She took her red pencil and wrote across the front in block letters, "Read before editorial meeting." She walked upstairs to the bustling city desk, navigated through the maze of ringing telephones and shouting reporters, and dropped the envelope squarely in the center of Gordon Spiel's desk. 40 minutes later, a copy boy appeared at the top of the basement stairs and shouted her name. Miriam walked back up to the city room and entered Spiel's glass-walled office. Spiel was sitting behind his desk, the pages of her draft spread out before him. He looked up as she closed the door. He did not look pleased. He raised his right hand and tapped his desktop twice with his index and middle fingers, his unconscious tell when he was about to dismantle a reporter's work. "It reads like a thriller, Miriam," Spiel said, his voice gravelly and low. "It's compelling, it's horrifying, and I cannot print a single goddamn word of it." Miriam stood perfectly still. "Every fact in that draft is documented." "Is it?" Spiel leaned forward, tapping the page that detailed the nursing logs. "You have an unnamed source claiming the logs were altered. Let's assume I know who this source is. Let's assume it's the nurse you ambushed in the parking lot. She countersigned those logs, Miriam. By her own admission, she is an accomplice to medical fraud, acting under duress. Do you know what a competent defense attorney will do to her on a witness stand? He will destroy her in an hour. He will paint her as a disgruntled, incompetent employee trying to shift the blame for her own negligence onto the administrator." "She is telling the truth," Miriam said. "The handwriting will prove it." "What handwriting?" Spiel shot back. "You don't have the physical logs. You have a description of logs locked in a room you cannot access. A handwriting expert comparing documents you have never seen is not a second source. It is a phantom." "The foundation director is a dead man," Miriam pressed, keeping her voice steady. "The physician is on the payroll. The wills were amended within months of death using the same typewriter." "Circumstantial," Spiel said, shaking his head. Highly suspicious, yes, but circumstantial. You are accusing a prominent local businessman and a practicing attorney of a quadruple homicide. If we run this, and Greaves produces logs that look perfectly normal because he's had time to forge entirely new pages, he will sue this newspaper into bankruptcy, and he will win. Spiel sighed, rubbing his eyes. I need a second independent source, Miriam. I need paper. I need the logs, or I need someone else inside that facility to go on the record. Until then, I will not run it. Miriam looked at the framed photograph of Spiel's daughter's wedding on the corner of his desk. She understood his fear. He was protecting the institution. I will get the paper, she said. She turned and left the office. She returned to the basement and spent the next 2 hours mechanically clipping and filing the weekend obituaries, her mind racing through the permutations of how to force Nolan Greaves to make a mistake. She needed to bypass the locked records room. She needed a vulnerability. At 1:15, the telephone on her desk rang. It was Spiel. My office, he said. The gravel in his voice was gone, replaced by something cold and hollow. Now. Miriam walked back upstairs. The atmosphere in the city room had shifted. The frantic energy of the morning had settled into a tense, quiet hum. When she entered Spiel's office, he was on the telephone. He was not speaking, he was listening, his jaw tight. He met Miriam's eyes, nodded once to whoever was on the other end of the line, and said, Understood. The sound of Spiel's telephone being set down on its cradle very carefully, no click, deliberate, a man controlling himself, echoed in the small glass room. Spiel folded his hands on the desk. He did not tap his fingers. The Lakeview Terrace Convalescent Home, he said quietly, is a quarter-page advertiser in our Sunday edition. They have been for 6 years. Miriam felt a cold weight settle in her stomach. She knew exactly what was coming. The publisher's office received a telephone call this morning, Spiel continued, his eyes locked on hers, from Nolan Greaves. He complained, quite forcefully, that a plain dealer employee has been harassing his staff, ambushing his nurses in the parking lot, and attempting to disrupt the operations of a medical facility. He knows I'm close, Miriam said. He's trying to cut off the investigation. He has cut it off, Spiel said flatly. The publisher called me 5 minutes ago. You are reassigned to the Home and Garden Features desk effective immediately. You will clear your things out of the morgue by the end of the day. Miriam stared at him. You're killing the story because of a Sunday ad buy? I'm killing the story because you don't have the proof to defend us against a libel suit, and now the subject of your investigation is threatening our business relationship. Spiel's voice finally rose, cracking like a whip in the confined space. He took a breath, reining himself in. Listen to me, Miriam. I fought for you. I told the publisher you were chasing a legitimate lead, but I have my orders. You are off this, and I was instructed to make this absolutely clear. If you contact anyone connected to Lakeview Terrace on company time, you will be dismissed. Fired. No severance, no union grievance. Do you understand me? Miriam looked at the man. He was not corrupt. He was just frightened of the consequences, a middle manager caught between the truth and the ledger. I understand, Miriam said. She walked out of the office. She did not go to the Home and Garden desk. She did not go to the basement to pack her things. She walked straight out the front doors of the Plain Dealer building and into the biting October wind. She understood the reality of her situation with absolute clarity. Greaves had identified her. He had used his leverage. She had lost her institutional cover. She was no longer Miriam Voss, reporter for the paper of record. She was investigating as a private individual, holding a press card that now carried no institutional weight whatsoever. If she pushed Greaves now, she would be trespassing. If she pushed Pruitt, she would be harassing a private citizen. She walked 2 blocks down Superior Avenue until she found a drugstore. She went inside, ignoring the soda fountain, and stepped into the wooden phone booth in the back corner. She dropped a dime into the slot and dialed the Cuyahoga County Probate Court. She asked for Terrence Albu. Albu, his voice came through the line. "Terrence, it's Miriam Voss." There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end. Terrence Albu's voice through the payphone receiver had the slight electronic thinness of a long-distance call, though he was only across town. "Miriam, you shouldn't be calling me here. I heard what happened." "News travels fast." "Greaves has friends in the county commissioner's office," Albu said, his voice dropping to a frantic whisper. "They're asking questions about who has been pulling the Lakeview probate files. If they find out I pulled the Finn file for you a day before your formal request was logged, Miriam, I could lose my pension. I could face charges for mishandling records." "I won't give them your name, Terrence. You know that." "It doesn't matter what you give them. They have the logs." Albu sounded terrified, the tremor in his left hand likely acting up as he held the receiver. "You need to drop this. Greaves is too insulated." "I can't drop it," Miriam said. "I'm locked out. I need to know if you found anything else before they shut you down." There was a long, agonizing silence on the line. Miriam could hear the faint sound of typewriters clacking in the background of the probate office. Albu was a frightened man, but he was also a man who believed, fundamentally, that public records belonged to the public. He hated the dark spaces where men like Greaves operated. "One thing," Albu finally whispered. "I shouldn't have looked, but after you told me about the foundation, I went down to the county recorder's office. I pulled the deed transfer records for Wallace Finn's property, the West Side duplex." Miriam pressed the receiver hard against her ear. "Where did the deed go?" "It didn't go to the Crestwood Benevolent Foundation," Albu said. "It transferred to a holding company. But Miriam, I checked the corporate registration for the holding company. The registered agent in Delaware. It's the exact same commercial firm used by Crestwood, the exact same address in Dover. Two different entity names, but they share the same mail drop." Miriam's mind raced. "What's the name of the holding company?" "The Hartwell Property Trust," Albu said. "Miriam, please, don't call me again." The line went dead. Miriam hung up the phone. She stepped out of the booth. The scope of the scheme had just fractured wide open. If Finn's real estate went to a separate trust, it meant the foundation was only the repository for the liquid assets, the bank accounts, the stocks. The real estate was being siphoned off into a parallel structure. The Crestwood Benevolent Foundation controlled far more assets than its public filings suggested. Miriam spent the rest of the day and the entire evening alone in her apartment. The radiator hissed in the corner, fighting a losing battle against the drafty windows. She cleared her small kitchen table and spread out her index cards, her red pencil, and the copies of the Delaware corporate directories she had painstakingly transcribed at the public library weeks ago. She began cross-referencing the registered agent address in Dover, Delaware. She scanned down columns of tiny, blurred print, her eyes aching behind her steel-rimmed glasses. She was looking for the Hartwell Property Trust. At 11:30 at night, she found it. She underlined the entry in red pencil. The Hartwell Property Trust. Registered agent, the same Dover address. Date of incorporation, 4 years prior, the exact same month the Crestwood Benevolent Foundation was incorporated. And there, listed as the incorporating attorney on the public filing, Desmond Pruitt. Miriam sat back in her chair. The architecture of the fraud was breathtaking in its cynicism. Greaves and Pruitt had built a machine. Greaves provided the victims, isolating them, withholding their medication, hastening their deaths. Pruitt provided the legal structure, amending the wills and building the Delaware shell companies to catch the money and the property as it fell. It was larger than 4 estates. It was a systematic harvesting of the vulnerable. She looked at the red lines on her index cards. She had no newspaper behind her. She had no subpoena power. She had no physical proof of the falsified logs. But she had the Hartwell Property Trust, and Pruitt did not know she had it. Miriam made a decision. It was a dangerous, irreversible decision. She could not force Greaves. He was too arrogant, too secure behind his locked doors and his advertiser leverage. But Desmond Pruitt was a lawyer. He was a man who understood liability. He understood exposure. She would go directly to Pruitt's office in the morning. She would not ask for an interview. She would not act like a reporter. She would act like an executioner. She would bluff him. She would tell him she was taking the Hartwell connection directly to the Ohio Attorney General, regardless of what the plain dealer did. She reasoned that Pruitt's reaction, his panic, his denial, or his attempt to bargain, would tell her whether there was something in his office she did not yet know about. At 8 o'clock the next morning, Miriam walked down Euclid Avenue. The sky was a bruised purple, threatening rain. She passed the department stores and the banks, her heavy coat buttoned to the neck. She did not feel the cold. She felt a singular, burning focus. She entered Pruitt's office building and took the elevator to the second floor. She walked through the frosted glass door that bore his name in gold leaf. The receptionist, a young woman meticulously typing a brief, looked up. "May I help you?" "Miriam Voss," Miriam said. "To see Mr. Pruitt." The receptionist's eyes widened slightly. She did not ask if Miriam had an appointment. She stood up immediately, walked to the heavy oak door of Pruitt's inner office, knocked once, and opened it. She murmured something Miriam could not hear, then stepped back. "He will see you." Miriam walked in. Desmond Pruitt's office was a monument to manufactured prestige. Heavy leather chairs, dark mahogany wainscoting, and framed diplomas that he had paid a sign painter to reproduce in more flattering proportions. Pruitt was sitting behind his desk. He looked entirely different from the composed, careful man she had ambushed at the coffee counter days earlier. His tie was loosened, his face was pale, the skin around his eyes bruised with exhaustion. And sitting in plain view on the green leather blotter of his desk was a silver flask. He made no effort to conceal it. Miriam did not sit down. She stood in front of the desk, keeping her hands at her sides.
"Mr. Pruitt,"
she said. Pruitt stared at her. He did not offer a greeting. He did not use his usual subordinate clauses to bury his meaning. He just looked at her with the hollow eyes of a man who knew the ground was giving way beneath him.
"I know about the Hartwell Property Trust,"
Miriam said, her voice ringing with absolute, terrifying certainty.
"I know it shares a registered agent with the Crestwood Benevolent Foundation. I know you incorporated both entities in the same month 4 years ago. I know Wallace Finn's real estate was transferred to Hartwell while his liquid assets went to Crestwood."
Pruitt did not blink. He reached out and rested his fingertips on the silver flask. "Nolan Greaves had my editor kill the story yesterday," Miriam continued, stepping one pace closer to the desk.
"He thinks he has insulated himself. He is wrong. At noon today, I am walking into the Ohio Attorney General's office. I am filing a formal complaint detailing the corporate structure of Hartwell and Crestwood, the fabricated identity of Edmund Harrow, and the falsified medical logs at Lakeview Terrace. I am doing this as a private citizen. The Plain Dealer's advertising department cannot stop the Attorney General from issuing subpoenas for your bank records."
She stopped. She let the silence fill the room, heavy and suffocating. She waited for the denial. She waited for the threat of a lawsuit. Pruitt slowly withdrew his hand from the flask. He looked down at his desk. He looked like a man who had been holding his breath for 4 years and was finally, inevitably, forced to exhale. Without speaking, Pruitt reached down and pulled open his left desk drawer. Miriam tensed, her eyes locking on his hand. Pruitt brought his hand up and placed an object on the center of the green leather blotter, exactly between them. The weight of Pruitt's sealed envelope on the desk was obvious. A standard white business envelope, visibly thick, sealed with the flap pressed down hard enough to leave a crease in the heavy paper. Pruitt pulled his hand back. He looked up at Miriam. He did not say a word. He simply gestured to the envelope with a slight, trembling nod of his head. Miriam's eyes remained fixed on the envelope. The heavy, cream-colored paper bore no return address, but the flap was pressed down with a severity that had left a permanent crease in the thick grain. She reached across the green leather blotter. Pruitt did not move to stop her. His hands remained flat on the desk, inches from the silver flask he had abandoned. She broke the seal. The tearing of the paper sounded unnaturally loud in the quiet, wood-paneled office. Inside were 3 sheets of legal-ruled paper, covered in a tight, precise script that leaned aggressively to the right. It was the handwriting of a man accustomed to drafting clauses that left no room for misinterpretation, a man who built cages out of vocabulary. Miriam began to read. She did not touch her red pencil. She did not reach for her notebook. She simply absorbed the architecture of the conspiracy as Desmond Pruitt had laid it out. The document named Nolan Greaves in the very first sentence, identifying him unequivocally as the sole architect of the estate-skimming enterprise. It detailed the 4 transfers with accounting precision, matching the timeline Miriam had built in her own mind. Harold Cushing, $31,000. Ora Blackwell, $44,000. Wallace Finn, a $19,000 duplex transferred to the Hartwell Property Trust. Estelle Norbury, $56,000 in liquid assets routed to the Crestwood Benevolent Foundation. In the middle of the second page, Pruitt had written, "The identity of Edmund Harrow, listed as director of the Crestwood Benevolent Foundation, is a fabrication I executed using the Social Security number of a deceased Youngstown resident at the explicit direction of Nolan Greaves." But it was the third page that made the breath catch in Miriam's throat. Pruitt had documented the mechanics of the deaths. To accelerate the probate timeline and ensure the swift transfer of assets, Greaves instituted a policy of deliberate medical neglect. He issued verbal instructions to nursing staff to withhold prescribed cardiovascular and respiratory medications from the targeted residents. These instructions were never committed to paper. Following the expiration of the residents, Greaves personally altered the medication administration logs to reflect doses that were never given, compelling staff to countersign the falsified records under threat of immediate termination. Miriam finished the third page. She placed it face up on the blotter. Then, methodically, she picked up the first page and read the entire document a second time. The grandfather clock in the corner of Pruitt's office ticked off the seconds, a heavy, brass rhythm. The muffled sound of Euclid Avenue traffic drifted through the window glass. Miriam read twice without speaking a single word. "You kept this," Miriam finally said, her voice perfectly level. "Because you knew he would eventually cut you out." "I kept it," Pruitt replied, his subordinate clauses falling into their familiar, practiced rhythm. "Because a man who is willing to falsify nursing logs to hasten a death is not a man who will honor a gentleman's agreement regarding the division of foundation receipts. I knew Greaves would eventually turn on me once he discovered I was skimming a percentage of the liquid transfers into a separate account. This envelope was my guarantee of mutual destruction." "And now?" "Now," Pruitt said, looking down at the handwritten pages, "the guarantee is worth more as cooperation than as a threat. You have the Hartwell Property Trust connection. You have the Delaware registrations. You are going to publish this, with or without my envelope, and the Attorney General will follow your ink. I prefer to shape what happens next, rather than be buried by it." Miriam looked at the 60-year-old attorney. The framed diplomas on his wall, painted in flattering proportions, suddenly looked like artifacts of a ruined civilization. The faint smell of rye whiskey hung in the air between them, sharp and pathetic. "Will you repeat what is in this document to the Cuyahoga County prosecutor?" Miriam asked. It was a direct question, devoid of journalistic maneuvering. Pruitt straightened his posture slightly, adjusting his cuffs. "I will do so only if I receive a formal cooperation agreement from the prosecutor's office, in writing, prior to making any sworn statement. I will not incriminate myself on the record without a guarantee of reduced exposure." He was precise about this. He was a lawyer to the end, negotiating his surrender with the same cold mechanics he had used to draft Estelle Norbury's final will. Miriam stood up. She did not ask to take the document. She knew its contents, and she knew Pruitt would not let it out of his sight until he had his deal. She turned and walked out of the office. She did not return to the plain dealer building. She walked directly down the concrete expanse of Euclid Avenue, turning south toward the Cuyahoga County Prosecutor's Office on Ontario Street. The October wind coming off Lake Erie carried the faint, metallic scent of the steel mills, a bitter reminder of the city's industrial spine. Cleveland, in 1961, was a city of heavy machinery and hard bargains, and Miriam was about to force the hardest bargain of all. She had no appointment. When she reached the prosecutor's floor, the air was thick with cigarette smoke and the aggressive clatter of manual typewriters. She approached the receptionist, a young woman filing carbon copies, and asked to speak with any available assistant prosecutor. She presented her plain dealer press card, though she knew it currently carried no institutional weight behind it. She was made to wait 40 minutes on a hard wooden bench before being shown into an office that smelled of floor wax and old coffee. Assistant Prosecutor Helen Massey sat behind a desk piled high with manila folders. Massey was a woman who looked as though she had spent her entire career dismantling the lies of desperate men. Her eyes were sharp, her dark wool suit immaculate, her demeanor entirely devoid of warmth. Miriam sat down and began to build the structure. She laid out the 4 probated wills, pointing out the identical worn lowercase e from the typewriter template. She presented the Caro retainer document, proving the physician who certified all 4 deaths as natural was on the facility's payroll for $40 a month. She produced the Delaware registration bearing the dead man's identity and the deed transfer records Terrence Albu had helped her find, linking Wallace Finn's property to the Hartwell Property Trust. Finally, she described Desmond Pruitt's confession document, quoting the lines about the verbal medication withholding instructions and the falsified logs from memory. She stated Pruitt's willingness to cooperate in exchange for an agreement. Helen Massey listened for 90 minutes. She did not interrupt. She took notes on a yellow legal pad with a fountain pen, her face an unreadable mask of procedural skepticism. When Miriam finished, Massey set her pen down and aligned it perfectly parallel to the edge of her notepad. "You have a compelling chain of circumstantial paper, Miss Voss," Massey said, her voice methodical and dry. "But you are alleging a cross-state fraud syndicate and 4 counts of murder by neglect, orchestrated by a respected facility administrator and an officer of the court. I need 24 hours to review these documents and to contact the Delaware Attorney General's office regarding the Foundation's corporate status." Massey leaned forward, resting her elbows on the desk. "Do not publish a word of this until I call you back. If Greaves reads about this before we have our arms around the Delaware entities, he will incinerate every nursing log in that building." Miriam walked to a payphone in the marble-lined lobby of the county building. She deposited a dime and dialed the plain dealer city desk. When Gordon Spiel answered, she gave him a concise summary of her meeting with Massey. "The prosecutor's office has the documents," Miriam said, the heavy black receiver pressed tight against her ear. "They are reviewing them now. Pruitt is ready to turn state's evidence." Over the line, Miriam could hear the distinct, rhythmic sound of Spiel tapping his desktop with 2 fingers. "Do you have a second independent source, Miriam?" "The prosecutor's review itself is the corroboration," Miriam argued, staring at the scuffed marble floor of the lobby. "Pruitt's confession validates the paper trail. The documents are credible." "A prosecutor reading a file is not a source on the record," Spiel said, his voice heavy with the caution that had defined his career since the 1954 libel settlement. "Call me when Massey calls back, not before." The line went dead. The next 31 hours were an exercise in suffocating restraint. Miriam sat in her apartment, the steam radiator hissing in the corner, fighting the urge to march back into the newsroom. She did not go to the library. She sat at her kitchen table with her personal notebook, staring at the names she had underlined in red pencil. 4 deaths, 1 facility, 1 foundation, 1 attorney, 1 administrator. The structure was complete, but it was frozen in amber, waiting for the machinery of the law to catch up to the truth. She drank black coffee and watched the second hand of her wall clock sweep in endless, agonizing circles. The telephone on her wall finally rang at 2 o'clock the following afternoon.
Miss Voss,
Helen Massey said. There was no preamble. The Delaware Attorney General's office has confirmed that the Edmund Harrow identity is entirely fraudulent. The Crestwood Benevolent Foundation's corporate filings are officially under review for fraud. The Cuyahoga County Prosecutor's Office is opening a formal criminal investigation. Miriam closed her eyes, letting the breath out of her lungs in a long, silent exhale. We are contacting Desmond Pruitt's outside counsel this afternoon to negotiate the parameters of a cooperation agreement, Massey continued. But I need you to hold the story for 48 more hours.
Why?
Miriam asked, her grip tightening on the phone. Because Nolan Greaves does not know Pruitt has defected, Massey said. We need to reach Greaves for formal questioning before he reads about his own impending arrest in the morning edition. Give me 48 hours to secure the administrator.
You have it,
Miriam said. Miriam took the bus down Euclid Avenue and walked into the Plain Dealer building. She bypassed the morgue in the basement and walked directly into the chaotic hum of the city room. She stood in front of Gordon Spiel's desk. He looked up from a piece of copy, his eyes narrowing at her presence on the floor.
Massey called,
Miriam said. Delaware confirmed the ghost director.
The county is opening a formal criminal investigation. Pruitt is negotiating his surrender. They are moving on Greaves in 48 hours.
Spiel stared at her. He did not tap his desk. He looked at the framed photograph of his daughter's wedding, then back to the 41-year-old woman in the steel-rimmed glasses who had dismantled a murder syndicate on her own time. He did not apologize for reassigning her to the home and garden features. He did not mention the quarter-page advertiser pressure from Lakeview Terrace. He simply nodded once. Write the story fully, Spiel said, his voice dropping its usual defensive edge. Bring it directly to my desk. Write it clean and accurate, Miriam. I'll run it above the fold. 47 hours after Miriam's meeting with Helen Massey, a dark Plymouth sedan pulled into the circular driveway of the Lakeview Terrace Convalescent Home. A Cuyahoga County Sheriff's investigator in a trench coat walked through the glass double doors. Nolan Greaves was sitting at his desk, perfectly composed, his suit immaculate. The bowl of wrapped candies sat in its usual place on the polished wood. When the investigator informed him that he was required to accompany him downtown for formal questioning regarding the Crestwood Benevolent Foundation, Greaves did not lose his temper. He did not raise his voice. He did not demand to know who had spoken. He simply stood up, adjusted his cuffs, and asked to telephone his attorney. He specifically requested a lawyer from a firm on Public Square, making no mention of Desmond Pruitt. Greaves was escorted out the front doors, past the receptionist who had once given Miriam his name without hesitation. By noon, the facility was placed under emergency county administrative supervision, pending a full investigation into resident welfare. Across town, Ruth Ann Solik received a telephone call from the prosecutor's office. She was brought in as a material witness. Helen Massey sat across from the broad-shouldered nurse and offered her a formal cooperation agreement. Ruth Ann, her hands trembling in her lap, gave a full, sworn statement detailing the blank spaces in the medication logs and Greaves's handwriting filling them in after the deaths. The agreement Massey drafted kept Ruth Ann Solik's name entirely out of the newspaper. Furthermore, through quiet channels at the County Health Board, Massey secured Ruth Ann a new nursing position at a different, strictly regulated facility on the west side. Ruth Ann's hidden conflict, her desperate need to protect her 14-year-old son, and her crushing guilt over Wallace Finn was resolved. It was not resolved through a sudden burst of fearless courage, but through the ironclad legal structure Miriam Voss had meticulously built around her, a structure strong enough to bear the weight of the nurse's vulnerability. It was 4 a.m. Miriam Voss sat alone on a wooden bench in the Plain Dealer lobby. Beneath her feet, she could feel the vibration of the massive printing presses in the sub-basement. It was a deep, mechanical pulse that traveled through the floor tiles and into her bones, the heartbeat of the city's paper of record. The sound was a low, continuous roar, the physical manifestation of truth being stamped onto paper thousands of times a minute. Through the east-facing windows of the lobby, the gray morning light of November was beginning to bleed into the sky. It was a flat, uncompromising light, the kind of light that stripped away shadows and made everything look starkly factual. A dock worker in heavy canvas overalls pushed a wire cart through the lobby doors, dropping a stack of the first press copies onto the reception desk. Miriam stood up and walked over. She picked up the top paper. It was still warm from the press. The sharp, petroleum-sweet smell of fresh ink hit her senses, a scent she had known for years in the basement morgue, but which now carried a profoundly different weight. There it was, above the fold, dominating the front page. State opens probe of 4 deaths at East Side Care Facility. Beneath the headline was her byline, by Miriam Voss, plain dealer staff writer. Spiel had made the change himself. He had stripped away her invisible status as an obituary writer without asking her, and she felt no urge to object. Miriam read her own prose. It was clean, methodical, and devastating. It laid out the corporate shell game, the physician retainer, the falsified logs, and the impending state action. But as her eyes moved down the column, she noticed a gap. Spiel had cut one paragraph. It was the paragraph she had written near the end, mentioning her own mother's death at a county facility 6 years earlier, the quiet, personal engine of grief that had made her look twice at Estelle Norbury's beneficiary line in the first place. Miriam stared at the space where the paragraph had been. For a moment, she felt a flare of protective anger. But as she read the surrounding text again, she understood. The absence of her personal history made the story colder. It removed any hint of a vendetta. It made the journalism absolute, objective, and legally unassailable. Spiel was right to cut it. The truth did not need her grief to give it weight. The facts were heavy enough on their own. Miriam reached into the pocket of her wool coat and pulled out her red pencil. She smoothed the warm newspaper flat against the reception desk. With a steady hand, she pressed the graphite against the newsprint. The texture of the pencil dragging across the porous paper was a small, satisfying friction. She underlined her byline once, lightly. Then she folded the paper, put the red pencil back in her pocket, and walked out into the cold Cleveland morning.